Looks all good, thank you. Well, good morning everybody from my side of the world or from our side of the world, and good afternoon or good evening wherever you are joining us. Thanks for joining us today and for being interested in our topic. We know these are kind of unprecedented times, and we are coming to you from our living room / kitchen table. So hopefully it's going to work all fine with our technology. We have had a dry run, so it should be fine. What Ben and I are going to talk about today. No, I'm supposed to. There. Nope. Ah. Sorry.
So if you just click on the viewer at the top, it will go back to the full.
Should go back to the full. I've tried to go onto it.
The top.
Oh.
Different system.
Okay. I try this one. No.
Right hand.
It was done before.
Cool.
Somehow I cannot do anything at the moment, Jill. I'm trying to push the button, but it doesn't do anything on my side.
Okay, let me try again. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Now, if you push the button, will it work? The forward button. There we go.
Ah.
No. Ah, yes. Now we are there.
Okay.
Just it. Yeah. So what we are going to talk about today is just a quick outline. First, we're going to talk about our home discipline. We are both in a marketing department, but we're macro marketers, so we are not usual marketers as such. And our general research interests, before I go and talk about the facets of well-being and quality of life, which is something that really interests me, and my view on the research on consumption and well-being. So that's my discipline, our discipline, linked to the well-being and quality of life area. And then we will briefly talk about our own research. I talk about exploring links between sustainable consumption and well-being, and Ben talks about the case of consumption and mobility. No, Jill, I can't do anything to get down. It just doesn't let me do anything.
Okay, I can forward for you if you want to just say
yes.
Next slide. Sorry.
We play. Okay, so macro marketing, you want to talk about, Ben?
Yeah, macro marketing is a community of scholars who have been meeting around the world for 45 years to talk about the difficult problems in and around markets and how to improve the environment, society, and business. This is the benefit of all people, not just business. And Joe Sergi, of course, the leading quality of life researcher, is a long-time macro marketer we're very proud to have currently editing our journal.
So within this kind of broader area of marketing and macro marketing is where our research lies. And next slide, please. We are interested in the wider implications of consumption. So we are really looking at understanding ordinary people consumption behavior and their link to different facets of quality of life and well-being. And in our discipline, this is maybe worth noting because we often look at subgroups in the population. So we look at people who are already interested in something, sustainable consumption or particular type of consumption. But what we want to look at is at the whole population as such. And the basic view that we both take is that we need to gain a better view of understanding what's going on with consumption's influence on well-being. Obviously, there is often an overall negative perception that consumption and well-being are kind of, or consumption is often explored in a context where it's not so positive for the well-being concept, and we need to understand more about it. On the next slide, please. So with quality of life and well-being, I don't think I need to talk much about this to that audience, but we all know that in the current situation, or particularly a few months ago when the world was still in a more equilibrium state as we knew it, well-being and quality of life have become buzzwords in research, government, public institutions. And it wasn't only the New Zealand government, but of course, that's where I have my examples for. So we had, for example, a well-being budget, and the New Zealand government talked about the 4 well-beings, and somehow it became everything and nothing. Nobody could really say what these 4 well-beings actually are, and everybody just made up their own mind about it. And from my point of view, I think it's really interesting. If we want to measure something, then we need to be clear what the conceptualization of the construct is. And we also need to know what the operationalization is. So in this whole quality of life well-being construct, I'm often interested in the dependent variable. So this is what we want to measure and make sure we measure it well. On the next slide, please. Can you forward to one?
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, yes. So, yes, perfect. So there are these 3 big areas of quality of life well-being, and I have looked at the subjective well-being, hedonic well-being, and eudaimonic well-being, well known within our circles. Of course, in other areas, not so well known about these 3 aspects of it. And then I'm going to try and operationalize these areas. And with subjective well-being, on the next slide, please. I'm generally using overall satisfaction with life as a whole, or satisfaction with domains of life. Personal well-being index is what I generally apply. And I think about this as the cognitive evaluation of life. It works quite well because in marketing, of course, we have a lot of satisfaction research, satisfaction with consumption experiences, individual consumption experiences. So that extends rather nicely in my discipline. And on the next slide, please, with the hedonic well-being, I'm looking at the frequency of experiencing positive and negative emotions. And what I use in our research and in my research is orientation to pleasure, which is part of Peterson's et al. Orientation to happiness construct, because it links very nicely and closely to marketing. I know there are some criticisms of that scale and whether orientation to pleasure really measures hedonic well-being, but in our context, I think it works quite well. And then on the next slide, please, there is the eudaimonic well-being. This is the area where we have done a bit more research recently, particularly with Dina's flourishing scale and with a brief version of the meaning in life scale. And I'm trying to cover all 3 aspects of it in the context of consumption. And on the next slide, please, this is my own view of things a little bit, and this is by no means something that is kind of not debatable, but I think these 3 dimensions, or these 3 facets of subjective well-being, they match very well with this kind of rules of thumb that is coming out. I've heard Professor Edina talking about this, the 40-40-20, as we have so often, with 20% of our well-being is made up of circumstances, and these circumstances can be captured with the satisfaction with life domains quite often. This is where we are having kind of achieving in life standard of living in there. The 40% of genetics, they can be maybe a little bit approached with hedonic well-being, positive, negative feelings, optimists, pessimists. And then the decisions that we make, they can also be captured with the flourishing and meaning in life. And I think this is where we can link towards policy implications in marketing in general as well. And on the next slide, please. If I look at our consumption and well-being, so my discipline and how we have looked at consumption and these ones, then we can see on the next slides that negative well-being has very often been looked at with materialism, and it's kind of, this is the negative part of things. So this is the overconsumption, and of course overconsumption, just like addictive consumption, compulsive consumption, is negatively linked to well-being. But there are big areas as well where well-being has been explored in the context of consumption, and that's once again with this aggregation of material well-being and standard of living, where there is a positive relationship, then experiential consumption and pro-social spending, and then the next area of research that has looked at the context or the relationship between consumption categories and well-being. And if I aggregate this one step up on the next slide, then I could say that with materialism, it's a trait-like disposition to overconsume, and it's linked to well-being. Then with, on the next few slides, material well-being and standard of living is the ability to consume. The experiential consumption and the pro-social spending is a very interesting area, but when we look at it, it's almost always investigated from an individual act of consumption. So a lot of it is experiential research, experiments, and people will be asked if you are spending $50, $100, $300 on this or that. So it's one consumption experience. And what we are most interested in are these consumption categories. So these are kind of meso levels of consumption, aggregate areas of consumption, and they're linked to well-being. And on the next slide, this is where our own research is coming in. For the last several years, I think going on to 10 almost, we have looked at ethical and sustainable consumer behavior. We have developed several aggregate dimensions or hierarchies, we call it, of these concepts. And with sustainable consumer behavior, for example, there are, depending on the dimension of life that we're investigating, so whether it's sustainability at home or on holiday, there are 30 to 40 individual acts of sustainable consumption that are aggregated in this one kind of variable that we call sustainable consumer behavior. And I'm by no means an expert in materialism. There are thousands. I think the last review I've seen was 12 or 14,000 papers that have been looked at in a meta-analysis. But I was just interested because it's so prominent to have a quick look on materialism and our view of splitting it into different areas of these facets of quality of life. On the next slide, please, it shows our results to ethical, sustainable consumer behavior. And what we have done is we have linked this into these three big areas of quality of life. And this is why I think it's so important that we investigate in more detail how particular consumption areas link into our quality of life or well-being domains. And this is where quality of life and or life satisfaction, life domain satisfaction. So you can see on the screen, it's operationalized with the Personal Wellbeing Index by Bob Cummins, and satisfaction with life as a whole. There is a positive relationship, so correlation in that case. But the stronger relationship is by far with eudaimonic well-being and flourishing. It also makes sense that there is a correlation between people are trying to be more environmentally friendly, more sustainable, and also socially sustainable in their consumption behavior. And that links with this idea of flourishing scale, of flourishing, of leading a good life. What was really interesting for us is that the hedonic well-being and sustainable consumption is not correlated. So there is not a significant relationship between these two, because in a lot of research that we see, the reason why people are not undertaking sustainable consumption behaviors is because it's thought to be not fun to do. And what we have found in our research is that that has not an impact on it. So that's very encouraging also for policy implications, for example. On the next slide, this is my very quick, and as I said, I'm not an expert in that area, but investigation of materialism. In marketing, we use a lot of the times Richins scale, and Richins materialism scale is split into these three aspects: materialism as success, materialism as happiness, and materialism as centrality. And once again, on the next slide, if I look at it, and I look at it in detail, and you look at that consumer materialism overall scale, then we can see that, yes, of course, as expected, the negative correlation between materialism and quality of life is driven by satisfaction with life domains, with flourishing. But interestingly, whether this is good or bad, is that hedonic well-being and materialism in the data sets that I have available are positively correlated. And now on the next slide, if I actually split consumer materialism into more detail, which is always the thing that I think we are often aggregating too much in the consumption area, and I look at these 3 dimensions that are captured in the materialism scale as Richins uses it, then I can see that basically the entire negative thing is driven by happiness. So happiness is negative. The happiness component of materialism is negatively correlated with life domains and eudaimonia or flourishing, and the hedonic well-being is positively correlated with it. I do not mean at all that materialism is a good thing or anything like this, but I think it's interesting to look a little bit under the hood in more detail and see what is going on with this consumption that we so often study in the context of materialism and how it links to well-being. Not my area in detail, as I said, many people know much more about it than I do, but it emphasizes my point, which is on the next slide. And this is already the summary of my area, where I think there is this need to gain a better understanding of the complexity that we are facing with consumption. It's such a broad area, and this is why I think it's also a fascinating area to look at it with its influence on well-being. And from my research point of view, it's interesting, and there is a need to be specific in this conceptualization of the concepts of facets of well-being, and of course the operationalization. So what do I actually use to measure this thing that is called well-being, happiness, or quality of life? And this is all from me, and I pass over to Ben on the next slide, please.
And one of the things that we do a lot of research around is mobility, because mobility has a central place in people's lives. It's what enables us to get to work, to get to family, to get to nature, to all of those aspects that impact on our quality of life. And now I'm going to talk to you about supermarkets and nudging past the least resistance. And if you're not in a marketing department, you may not have noticed that there's a one-way system in that supermarket, that when you walk through a supermarket, there's a path of least resistance. And I encourage everybody to try and go the wrong way in a supermarket sometime and see how many social mores they can break, where no one has put a directional sign on the floor. No one has indicated this is the one-way system. We are just nudged into gently all going like sheep in the right direction. And that's not just in the supermarket, that's in most of our life. So on the next slide, I've got a list here of different modes, and this is data from New Zealand. This is in descending order of satisfaction with the mode. So it's using the mobility satisfaction scale. And on the right, I've got the associated aspects of well-being that we see with this mode. So with cycling, we have moderate to high exercise. We see people covering reasonably large distances. They report a sense of community because they see people's faces without screens between them. They are part of nature. They are typically riding beside the grass and the trees and things. Motorcycles actually surprisingly have a very high satisfaction with their mobility, and that's almost all about self-efficacy. They get where they want to, and quickly. They don't get held up by traffic jams, so they get through. But the danger associated with motorcycling is one such that I couldn't encourage it to anybody. Of course, walking is our most natural act. From about 6 months, we all walk. It's part of what we do. And it gives us light exercise. We are close to other people. Currently less than 2 meters is not allowed, but we get exposure to nature. And even during the lockdown with COVID-19 in New Zealand, people are encouraged to go for a walk. with appropriate social distancing, because it's recognised as being a necessity for quality of life. Next in our order of satisfaction with mobility is the solo car driver who produces lots of carbon. There are lots of equity issues, there's congestion and expense. Some of the economic analysis on how long someone works each week to pay for the car to get to work to pay for the car paints a rather stark picture of this mode. Public transport is interesting. People who go by train are much happier than people who go by bus. But in both cases, train and bus, public transport creates exercise. Every time we see high use of public transport, we see high walking. People are prepared to walk a reasonable distance to get to the nearest stop and to walk from the end stop to their work or school or place of shopping. Car sharing is the least happy of the lot, and the thought that someone might be sitting in my car while I'm moving through my city is often expressed in qualitative research in terms of a violation of my privacy and what would happen if they changed the radio station, and some really quite surreal comments about this idea of sharing a car with somebody else. So that gives us some idea about where quality of life sits relative to different modes. And as we are re-emerging from our houses post-lockdown, how we choose to move is going to have a big impact. Will we go back straight to the default of being individuals in cars, part of the climate change problem, or will we walk more, will we cycle more and use more public transport? Next slide, please. And of course, mode shift is a wicked problem. We've got all sorts of non-linearity, we've got feedback loops, we've got randomness, and all around the world, governments recognizing the wicked problem of mobility, congestion, carbon, are trying to take this on. In the next slide, you'll see a list of, one of the often seen as the definitive list from Denmark, Netherlands, and Germany, from Puccio and Bühler, of how we can change toward making cycling irresistible. Cycling is seen as the sweet spot because it's the mode that gets us to cover reasonable distances without congestion, without pollution. This is their list, and it's not there for you to read, it's just the length of the list. And if we click the next slide, the build will show that at the bottom, those are the only ones that are not about changing infrastructure. Now, while we're thinking about infrastructure, about changing roads, about bike paths and things, I want you to actually think, just do a little thought experiment. What does a road look like? It's essentially a whole series of tennis courts lined up end on end. You know, we could put the tennis nets down the middle of a 4-lane highway and play tennis quite happily. It's exactly what it is. It's not dedicated to cars. It doesn't belong to cars. It is a flat surface that drains water reasonably well. So why we're fascinated on what this flat surface is, which we can dance on, cycle on, walk on, drive on, ice skate in winter, that's not the fundamental problem. The next slide takes us to another example. This is the same city, this is Christchurch, New Zealand, in 1937, where you see the emergence of the car coming in. 1954, we've got more cars post-war. In the next slide, we go to 1969, and Christchurch in 1969 was at the same level of cycling as the Netherlands. It was incredibly popular. It's a very flat city. It's quite spread out, but everybody cycled. My father, as a senior manager, would cycle to work in his suit shorts and long socks. I'm glad we've been saved from the 1970s fashions, but that was a cycling city. This is the city on the right-hand side, and I can't quite make out what year that was, but it pretty much wouldn't matter if it starts with a 2. That's what Christchurch looks like now. It's a very hostile place to ride a bike simply because of the number of cars. And if we look down the list of the line of those cars, none of them have a second passenger in them. Or maybe the first one does. The average number of people in a car in New Zealand is 1.3 at any one time, and that's almost entirely driven by parents dropping children at school. So that single driver in a car not having their personal space violated while taking up around 8 square meters of asphalt and carrying 1.5 tons of steel with them is the dominant mode. Okay, next slide, please. So what happens? Why don't people ride their bike, walk, ride public transport? What's stopping people moving in more sustainable ways through our society? Because every time I do a survey in New Zealand, we survey thousands of people and we have a large group of people, 40+%, who want to cycle, who want to walk, and who would use public transport if they could. And we know that all of those would be associated with increases in their quality of life through more exercise, more contact with society, with community, being in nature more often. Next slide, please. This is a model I've been working on for a long time, and it's not here for you to interrogate, it's here to show that there are all these different things interacting. We have personal aspirations, but they're inside collective aspirations. We are stuck in a supermarket, and the supermarket says, not you walk down this aisle this way and that way, it says you get in your car to go to work. That's what's normal. And all of these things impact on the way we move through the city and trap us in a suboptimal mode in terms of quality of life. We didn't choose to take the car. We didn't choose not to take the car. It's quite a big choice to overcome all of the messages that surround us, that get us in a car each morning to go to work. Next slide, please. Of course, we've got a whole series of changes in response angle and gradient, and we came back to two-factor theory and hygiene factors. We have to meet a minimum level before we can satisfy something. And once we've met that minimal level, then we might see an increase in a behavior at a useful rate. And our nephew, lives in a little town outside Vienna in Austria, and there's the 97% problem. So he lives 10 kilometers from his school roughly, and being 10 years old, it would be quite normal for him to cycle to school. The 97% problem is that there's a cycle route or a safe place to cycle for everything except for 300 meters of the way to school. And that would be his preferred and the normal way for him to get to school. Because of that 300 meters that's missing, he doesn't cycle to school. He's not allowed to because it's too dangerous. It's a very, very tight and quite intimidating piece of dense traffic. So what would give him exercise before school each day, which we know would increase his performance at school, would increase his happiness. He wouldn't be so over-energetic when he gets to school, would increase the happiness of the teacher, is paused because of 300 meters out of 10 kilometers. This is our response angle gradient problem. Next slide, please. So this is the typical Western country. 85% of us driving alone. 7.6 carpooling is actually pretty high, and almost certainly that is people dropping children at school. Most couples don't share a car when they go to work in New Zealand. They'll get in separate cars, drive down the same motorway, and then turn off at different exits. Cycling very low, walking very low, public transport also very low. There's a quality of life problem here. We know that people would be happier with more exercise. They'd be happier with more community connection and with more exposure to nature. Next slide, please. So, when we're looking at mobility as a quality of life issue, and its contribution. It's not enough to look at infrastructure. It's not a sufficient attribute to increase the well-being associated with mobility. We need to change the culture around it. We need to understand all the messaging that comes to us, to you, to children, to society, that traps them into automobility instead of ways of moving through society that are better for their quality of life. Next slide, please.
This is all we have today. Thank you. And I see that there are some comments, but I didn't dare to do anything on the screen. So I will now try to move this over a little bit so I can read it. I just didn't want to mess up with the technology. And then of course we will try to answer, or we will try to respond. So Joe was asking, Joe Sergi, about the influence of ethical consumer behavior. And I don't know, can everybody read these comments, Jill?
They can, but it might be good if you were to read the question first.
Okay, so talking about the influence of ethical consumer behavior and eudaimonic well-being, what might be examples of mediating variables that can help us better understand this relationship? Ooh, the mediators are always difficult, I think. Do you know a mediating variable that helps us understand this relationship better?
Well, we can throw thousands of them in there and run lots of models until the p-value comes out. If we're looking at the fundamental variables, why don't we stick with the fundamental variables? Why are we looking at the moderating or the mediating variables?
I have so of course it depends a little bit as well in which direction you're looking at and at this relationship. And you see that I had correlation there, and it was mostly for the purpose of this presentation. When I publish the research, I sometimes or often try to use a top-down approach and try to explain the meso-level consumption. So I try to explain sustainable consumption and see which of the different orientations to quality of life or well-being would help with that. So I am thinking about, a colleague of mine told me, is it still a rope or is it several different strings? And so is the relationship strong enough just between the two concepts, like what Ben has talked about, or do we need different strings coming in to explain the overall rope? And I try to keep it simple, but yes, I know what you mean, and I'm struggling with which variables I would think about it. If anything, at the moment, I'm trying to work on capturing that flourishing concept based a bit better, because at the moment I have used Dina's flourishing scale, and it's fairly well known, but it has only 8 items. So it might actually be too high a level of aggregation for what we are interested in. In our context, it's always a bit tricky because, of course, we're looking at consumption and well-being. So a well-being scale that has 27 items is very hard for me to operationalize because it's not the only thing I'm interested in. So it's always a kind of weighing off between detail and not. So that hasn't really answered your question. Sorry, Joe.
It is a nice leading to the next question.
Joe, I unmuted you if you wanted to comment, Joe.
Oh, this is truly fascinating, and I was just wondering what those mediators might be. But one thought, in terms of ethical consumption, is people who are much more ethical, you can kind of delve into the sort of the moral psychology of this, and get into the caring values. And then there is one particular dimension in ethics that deals with the self-concept as being much more global in the sense that people who are much more ethical tend to have a much more global or broader perspective of their wholeness, in the sense that it's not what something about the environment, for example, would affect them, although it doesn't really affect them personally, but it affects them in a very broader global sense. So there is some literature on that you're able to bring in to try and better, help us better understand that. But this is really truly fascinating that you found that this relationship. So it's kind of interesting to kind of further develop that into something much more beneficial.
We have looked at universalism as a personal value, and that strongly drives the ethical behavior and sustainable behavior, which is we're not the only ones who have found that. There is a lot of research on environmental, particularly behavior, and universalism as a value, which is also looking at this global kind of perception of the world more.
Right. Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. But the next question, was to what extent is flourishing a dependent variable, and could we also see it as an intermediate variable, internal and external buffers people have? And I think my answer is yes, definitely. And it's always this discussion about, is it like quality of life, top down, bottom up? Is it that certain, because people have high quality of life, they choose certain consumption areas, which is what we are sometimes looking at? Or is it that people are doing things and working up in their consumption towards higher quality of life? And it's one of these areas that I think is almost, I don't know if you can say not solvable, but at the moment I think so. And I keep going back in my publication to a very old reference by Alex Mikolos, who says along the lines of, it is a complex bidirectional concept. So there is room for top down, bottom up. And if there is room for top down and bottom up, then I think there is also room for mediators. I think with the area that we are working in, we are in an area where it becomes very, very hard to measure things. I mean, quality of life and what makes somebody happy, or why somebody is happy, if you're looking at the other way around, is so complex and so individual as well, that we are getting at the border of what is measurable, in my opinion. And we just try to learn a little bit more every time, but definitely intermediate variable, very happy to try.
But it's also a dependent variable if your goal is to increase flourishing. And if you wanted to have a flourishing society, then that might be the reason that's your dependent variable, and you stop there.
The next question really runs into this. Do you want to take this first?
So could you tell us about policy implications of this research with your findings? What kind of policies would you suggest local governments, national governments implement to see a shift in attitudes of people? And of course, just attitudes is probably not enough. We need to see shifts in behavior, shifts in consumption choices. And one of the clearest things, I mean, we live in a time when it's not appropriate or allowable to tax things or to discourage things economically, but we can fully price things. So when someone is sitting in a car on their own on a road, they have not met the full costs of that activity. By allowing them to pay the full costs of their activity, we would discourage that behavior. It's a rather simple sort of price quantity lever, but apart from that, there's a whole lot of policy around mode shift that we can do, around prioritizing the rights of vulnerable road users, the vulnerable people moving through our society. It certainly is a wicked problem.
For the sustainability research or ethical behavior, and I have to probably mention in response also to Joe's comment beforehand, that we have called this ethical consumption because in marketing and in tourism, where we have looked at as well, sustainable equals environmentally friendly. And we wanted to keep the social aspect in our research. So that's why we called it ethical, but we are probably not seated as much in the ethics research or literature than in the sustainable research. And we just wanted to kind of make, whether it was a good decision or not, make it obvious that we are not only interested in the environmental aspect, but we're also interested in the social aspect of consumption. And there, I think that there is so much emphasis going on about the that trying to make environmentally friendly behavior, let's go back to this one again, fun, or don't kind of get the less convenient factor away. But what our research would indicate is that it's values driven, and people would do it because they want something else out of their life. So you could, in your policy implications, get away from this it is fun or something like this, because people don't mind much about the fun area with ethical consumption in our cases. But it is about doing something good with your life, even if it's a small aspect of things. And I think with the area that we are looking at, the difficult part and the challenging part with policy implications is often that to change behavior at these levels takes time, and policy and politicians normally don't want to have time. They want to see results now. But one of the great success stories in New Zealand is drink driving, but it has taken 20 years of social marketing, government interventions, nudging in different directions. And now we are really very low on drink driving. It is unacceptable to drive drunk from a social point of view. And even now, young guys can shame other young guys who are trying to drink and drive. But it has taken 20 years, because 20 years ago, it was the norm. You went to the pub, you had your beers, and you drove home. So this is the challenge of it.
Verlay, and I think I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, Verlay Doctor or Aditi Mankey, the two that asked the questions. I have unmuted you if you wanted to ask any follow-up questions, or if they answered it correctly.
Yeah. I had a follow-up question. So I know we cannot radically change behavior of people, but I'm doing research on commute and subjective well-being, and I'm reading a lot of news that local governments, like in San Francisco, they are banning cars in certain streets just to see how they can reduce congestion. And recently I also heard that in France they are going to limit cars in certain areas of in certain sections of local cities. So how do you think that these kind of measures, do you think they might shift behavior of people, that it might motivate them to use public transportation?
Well, it's funny, because when we talk about banning something, we're not really motivating, we're forcing them to use something else. We're making it harder, and there's a long history of cities stopping people driving through the middle in the Netherlands. Vancouver's done a lot to make it harder to use a car. And now we're seeing cities like Vienna, like San Francisco, making some streets non-drivable. And it's a great policy intervention if we actually want to be serious about changing how people move through our cities. We have to make sure that there are alternatives alongside it. So there's no point saying, well, you can't drive here if you can't cycle, walk, or use public transport to get there as well. So certainly it's part of it, and it's a really complex problem. We need lots of solutions. If you're looking at best case, have a look at Vancouver, who've seen their transition really, really quickly with a sort of whole of system approach.
And so if you look at, I have some research about Austria and New Zealand in recycling, and New Zealand recycles on average much more often than Austria. And if you are digging deep, you can see that in New Zealand, getting rid of normal rubbish costs something, because you actually have to buy the rubbish bags at the supermarket. So you immediately have a feedback saying this is expensive. At the same time, recycling is made very easy. So you can put all the recycling together into one box and you leave it outside your house and it gets picked up. In Austria, you haven't got this. You just put your rubbish out and there is recycling, but you often have to walk 200, 300, 400 meters to get rid of glass and aluminium cans and stuff. So there is this combination of encouraging behavior by making it easy, or you could of course also run a campaign to talk about green, clean, beautiful New Zealand, as we do so often, and at the same time also kind of making something else harder. So, but the key one is that somebody, local politicians, need to want to do this. And we see in Austria, in Vienna, the Greens got into government in the city of Vienna, and suddenly a whole things became possible that beforehand, from a political side, were not possible. So it's a complex, really complex system, which is Spain's speciality.
And we're living in a world where we thought we couldn't do things until around a week ago. The thought of San Francisco streets being empty of cars, of an entire country being locked down and asked to stay home except for essential workers, was unfathomable. Many of these things, if we actually want to solve them, like climate change, we actually just, it's simply a matter of choosing and having some leadership, taking the citizens with them, explaining where we're going, how we're going, and we're doing it together. Yeah, we live in interesting times.
Thank you. So Verlay, Doctor, did you have a follow-up question or comment? Not sure if he's still here with us.
Oh, I think this is the one that has a, thanks for the response on the intermediate question on the little chat function.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Just 1 second. Let's see if I can unmute him real quick. While we're doing that, does anyone else have any other questions? Verlay, you're unmuted if you wanted to make a comment.
No, I'm fine. Thank you for the answer.
Sure. Any other questions from anyone? Okay, well, with that being said, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Obviously, a lot of people interested in this topic, and a lot of interesting comments from everyone. So thank you all for your participation. Thank you especially to our presenters. We really appreciate your time and the work that you put into this project. So I just want to remind everyone that we'll be sending the link out for this video on YouTube in a couple of days, so stay tuned. If you are not a member of ISQOLS, we encourage you to consider joining us, where there will be many, many more resources just like this. So please consider doing that. It's very, very affordable. For the membership, 50 USD for retired and students, and 75 USD for regular members for the entire year. So please consider that. You can join us at isqols.org. At this point, we're still making plans for our 2020 conference in August. The final decision whether or not to proceed with the conference will be made on June 15th. And so we'll be alerting everyone. Hopefully, we'll be able to convene in Rotterdam in August, and we'll be keeping everyone updated. With that, we'll say thank you to everyone, and remember to please stay tuned on our ISQOLS website, and take care. We hope that everyone stays safe and healthy. Thank you so much, Alexandra and Ben. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jill.
Stay safe.
Stay safe.